As a kid, I never really had the chance to be a Boy Scout, seeing as I lived in the middle of nowhere. These subscribers, though, were able to enjoy the Boy Scouts and enjoy all the great things Mother Nature has to offer. Not all of these stories shared here are fond memories, though. These subscribers share their allegedly true creepy experiences while being in the Boy Scouts. If you have a story you'd like to share in a future video, whether it be a Boy Scout story or something else, be sure to send it in to swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. Now, sit back, relax, and get ready. I was in the Boy Scouts back in the early 2000s with my best friend we'll call Joel. As normal troops do, we had campouts every now and again for badges and to bond with others in the troop. The thing I didn't realize was when I went on this trip, it'd be the last time I ever went camping. During the meeting for the campout, we were informed by our scoutmasters that we'd be going to a very well-known military base by the California coast. On the trip over, my friend carpooled with me, and we arrived a little later at around 9 p.m. From here, we set up our tent with help from other friends, and my older brother, who was an Eagle Scout. We went on a hike soon after, and then roasted marshmallows before our scoutmaster sent us to sleep for the night. My best friend crashed while I went to brush my teeth. A few miles away from the military base was performing artillery training, so it was pretty awesome to listen to it and talk about. Soon enough, I noticed something in the sky. It was hovering and completely silent, which was very unlike the jets that would sometimes do flybys. I also want to add, I don't believe it was a helicopter, as again, they make noise. The actual object in question was about 6 stories high in the air and was a blue spherical light. We stared at it for a good 20 seconds before it suddenly shot out of view. We were absolutely amazed by what we saw, and soon after, headed to our respective tents and headed back to sleep. The moment I got into my tent, I tried to tell Joel what I'd seen, but he just brushed it off and went back to sleep. Later that night, I was awoken by something and got out of bed. I had a bad feeling. I looked outside and saw a blue light. After a bit of struggling, I was able to wake my friend up, and he was confused and surprised by the blue light as well. While staring at the ball of light, I asked my buddy if his head hurt. He agreed that his head did hurt too, and I felt the same, and it was excruciating, but strangely bearable as well. The next thing I knew, everything went black. We awoke the next morning later than anyone else. While eating some eggs, one of the dads asked the scoutmaster what the blue light outside was after lights out. I was shocked to hear others notice this as well, but I also felt good knowing I wasn't crazy. That's when the same guy asked what was on my arm, and to my shock, I looked down and noticed 2 triangles made of 3 circles each, one facing right side up and one upside down, with a space between and a line made of 2 circles on the left side. Joel looked down and found the same on his arm. What was interesting was, the marks had little indentations. I guess that's what you would call them or something, where it looked like a needle had been placed in the middle of the marks. The marks themselves looked almost like a tattoo, but they were inflamed as something had gone into our skin. Later on, my mom saw these, freaked out, and took me to a dermatologist who claimed in 30 years of doing this job he had never seen anything like this before. Joe and his mother did the same and were just as perplexed. I remember every time I touched the marks I'd feel a burning sensation. I can say though, without a doubt, there are definitely things out there we don't understand. That night will likely remain a mystery the rest of my life. My stepdad has 2 younger brothers. The youngest is my age and the oldest is my sister's age. My grandma, stepdad's mother, put them in Boy Scouts. For the sake of anonymity, we'll call the youngest Ken and the oldest Mark. I was at a parade with my family when the Boy Scouts came marching by. My other family was busy collecting thrown candy like crazy while my grandma leaned over and asked if I remembered that Miles we took camping once. I didn't remember him at first as we went camping often and took others along a fair bit of the time. Then she refreshed my memory a bit. Miles was an assistant to Ken and Mark's troop and was especially helpful with socially awkward Mark. My grandma, being grateful for his help, invited him along to come camping with us. My grandmother then informed me Ken told her something that made her promise never to tell anyone. Miles took Ken down to the railroad bed while camping and told him to pull his pants down, and they'd play a game together. This game was something Miles was very insistent about. Ken never went along with it and immediately went home after this. My grandmother then approached Mark and asked him if Miles had made any unwanted advances on him. Mark said he did, but he didn't say anything because he was too worried he'd get in trouble. Miles apparently took Mark to a secret getaway before asking him to pull his pants down and touch him. My grandmother never said if Mark was coerced into this, but I imagine he was. Unfortunately, Mark was incredibly shy and socially awkward, which made him vulnerable to this creep. The remainder of the trip, my grandmother kept a close eye on Miles and was quite sure he knew she would often cut Miles off if he tried to be alone with Ken or Mark after Ken told him what he tried to do. My grandmother also warned my mother to watch him around her girls, but she said she didn't think he was into girls. My mother said anything to me, but I imagine she wasn't too concerned, or maybe she just didn't want us spreading the word. Ken made it clear my grandmother couldn't say anything, as then the whole troop would be interrogated and everyone would know he said something. My grandmother promised to keep it to herself, but I really wish she wouldn't have. Part of this is because of cases like one I heard about where a boy didn't come forward until years later about a Boy Scout leader molesting him. By the time he came forward, the guy was old and working with children in the church. I wonder what Miles is up to today. I hope he's been caught. When I was 19, I was a Venture Scout, which is essentially Boy Scouts for older kids and gender mixed. I decided to go on a week-long scouting trip with a friend of mine. Unfortunately, a few days prior to the trip, my friend bailed on me. This was a pain, of course, because it meant I'd be going on a hike in the mountains with a bunch of strangers. Upon arriving at the trip, I was the only Venture Scout, and only female. At first, I thought it might be a bit awkward, and it turns out most of the Boy Scouts were rather chill and kind. Although they weren't used to camping with girls, they accepted me as one of the guys. That said, there was this one guy, Danny, who from the first day of camp wouldn't stop staring at me. I find it awkward, but assumed maybe he was awkward or socially inept with women, and so I tried to brush it off. The next day we were paired off in twos and I was paired with Danny. The guy seemed a little too excited about hiking alone with me. His eyes were a bit too wide and it made him look a bit crazed. That said, he was a small guy, and so I figured I'd be able to handle him if I got out of turn with him. The guy was only 5'7", slightly shorter than I, and had unkempt hair. Prior to setting out on the hike, he had the gall to ask if I needed any help applying sunscreen. I told him no, but he persisted on asking. He was so insistent till one of the guys called him out on it. While on the hike, he then kept probing me about my age. I told him I'm about 19 or 20, but then he'd get all creepy and tell me not to lie. He said I was too innocent to be that old. Young innocent girls are the cutest, he'd say. Next, he started asking me questions about where I live. Did I have siblings? What was my favorite color? This seemed much more innocent until he asked if I'd ever heard of BDSM. I was caught off by this, and didn't like it at all. I kept dropping hints to drop the subject and pretended I didn't know what he was talking about. This is when he kept going on about it. He talked about tying up girls, hitting them, and burning them. I kept my chill, I won't lie, and to say I wasn't extremely uncomfortable was definitely not the truth. Internally at this point, I was just fed up. I didn't want to show weakness, thinking he'd get off on that. All I kept thinking was he really continuing on with this? This is when he began complimenting me. He began saying he didn't see a lot of girls these days with such pale skin. He'd asked if I used a moisturizer while trying to touch my hand. I decided to keep my arms on my backpack straps and away from him while he decided to tell me about my pale skin and how it was the most beautiful because you can see the burn marks and bruises more clearly. I felt sick and my stomach was turning knots now. Danny thought it was a good idea to ask if I was a virgin and if I was into rape fantasies. He then asked if I wanted to play rape roleplay with him. I was in disbelief at the way he said this, or that he'd bring it up at all. I looked at him and saw he was smiling. It was creepy. It was a childish sort of smile. That gave me chills. I looked away and quickened my pace. He was far too close to me. I kept thinking, I'm sure he saw the fear in me at this point. This was when, to my relief, I saw another pair of scouts too close to me. I kept thinking, I'm sure he saw the fear in me at this point. This was when, to my relief, I saw another pair of scouts ahead of us. I ran up to them suggesting, practically begging them, to pair up. They declined at first because we were supposed to be in groups of 2, but upon seeing my panic and distress, they agreed to tag along with us. We hiked to the top the entire time, and I made a point to stick close to the 2 other boys. On the way down, they asked if we wanted to trade partners. I looked back at Danny, who looked livid at this point. There is no doubt in my mind he got off on trying to make me uncomfortable and quite possibly would have tried something if I stayed alone with him much longer. I accepted the offer to switch partners, ignoring any pleas from Danny not to, and went down the mountain with much kinder, caring, and chill partner. On the way down the mountain, my new partner asked me if Danny was bothering me. I lied and said he wasn't bothering me too much, as I was 19 and thought it'd look pathetic for me to be distressed by some 15-year-old kid. All was going well till that night, when I was alone in my tent. It's always a little unnerving to be alone on a hike in the middle of nowhere. This said, the scoutmaster insisted I be far away from the boys' camp so they wouldn't bother me. This naturally only made me feel vulnerable, as I was quite sure Danny would try to bother me. Later that night, I heard rustling. I figured it was just a deer or elk and went back to sleep. Shortly after this, I heard my tent opening. Looking through a crack in my sleeping bag, I saw the white of an eye staring into my tent. It was Danny. I froze, holding my breath and gripping my dad's hunting knife just in case I needed to use it. I pretended to be asleep while waiting for my moment. Should he be stupid enough to come at me? Danny just stared at me, breathing heavily and muttering to himself. Eventually, about an hour, he left. The next morning, I was exhausted and kept close to the other scouts while getting naps where I could. It was hard to keep my cool and composure, which led to my fair share of disputes with the scout leaders. I felt on edge and defenses as every now and again Danny would creep up and try to caress my neck or feel my hair. Every night for the remainder of this trip, Danny was there watching. One night he went digging through my backpack, but unfortunately for him, I kept all my clothing and stuff in my sleeping bag. It's important to note, growing up, I've always been in hard situations, and kind of left on my own, so I always felt it showed weakness, asking for help, and didn't trust most others. So I felt only I had myself to rely on. It was because of this I was going to just tough out the rest of the week. Halfway through the week though, the scoutmaster called Danny away and soon after sent him home. I feel like the scout I partnered with must have noticed that Danny had been doing some weird stuff and filed a complaint to the scoutmaster. I thought this because while everyone else was confused and saying bye and all unhappy like, this scout had his arms crossed and was staring Danny down judgmentally. Somehow, Danny looked bewildered by it all. It was as though he honestly believed he didn't do anything wrong and wasn't sure why he was being sent home. I try not to think about the events that happened, but thankfully, the rest of the week went off without a hitch. I'm grateful that, although it wasn't allowed, my dad insisted I brought his hunting knife with me for protection. Having it made me feel safer, but it also might have saved me had Danny tried anything. I don't know where he is now, but I'm worried he will grow up to be a serial rapist or worse, with the way he was acting. At the very least, he was definitely disturbed. So this happened a few years ago. I was 12 and it was my first year as a Boy Scout. During our summer camp, we have this thing in Belgium where we go for a big hike during 3 days, and where we have to find people willing to host us for the night. This is how it got creepy. So after a long day of walking, we arrived at this village, and were about to start looking for a place to sleep. At this point we see a little old lady talking with another old guy, who was there with his dog. As soon as she sees us, she tells the man, "Here they come." The man and his dogs then proceed to walk down the road and away from our group. Seeing this, our leader, he was 16 at the time, decided to ask the old lady if she could help us. She just pointed to the guy with a finger and said, "Follow him." We did, and the guy was walking in front of us, then stopped at an old barn. He opened it and told us, "It's here." He then left. The barn had one of those doors that can only be opened from the outside. We were creeped out but glad not to have to look anywhere else to stay. So we stayed there. There was an upstairs in the barn where we slept in the hay, as far as possible from the stairs. In the morning, happy to be alive, we got a good look at the barn. We found an old sweatshirt looking like a kid's, and we saw someone that ate some of our food was downstairs. We knew it wasn't an animal because rats don't open a box of cheese. Needless to say, we quickly got out of there and left the village. Back in 2013, I was a young middle school teenager growing up in New Hampshire. I loved the outdoors and was a member of my local Boy Scout troop. We met up for troop meetings once a week and went on camping trips once a month. We always had a great time on these trips, but on this particular trip in April, my patrol leader did not attend, and therefore, I was asked to do a lot more than I was used to. Whether it was collecting more firewood, cooking our food, and of course, staying up late for the leader's meetings that lasted until 1 a.m., it was exhausting and I had little energy when I returned to my home, just waiting to play Infamous 2 on the PlayStation 3. My sister was waiting for me to be at the house, and 10 minutes after I plopped down on the recliner to play video games, she asked me if we could go into Boston to see the big race with her and my grandmother. Despite the fact that I love big cities, and I knew we would go to the Cheesecake Factory after, being a big food lover, I refused as I was so tired from the trip. My sister got really upset and begged me to come with her, and despite the fact that I was a pushover at the time, I said no. I was too tired and didn't want to do anything. My sister didn't want to go if I didn't, and the plans were cancelled. On April 15, 2013, the Boston Marathon bombing occurred, killing 3 people and injuring hundreds. Had I not been so lazy, I could have been paralyzed or killed in those explosions, as I know my grandmother would want us to be at the finish line. Always listen to your gut. It could save your life. God bless the victims of this terrible tragedy and their families. I was in the Boy Scouts as a kid in the South Carolina Low Country. We go on campouts about once a month, and one of the campsites we used pretty regularly belonged to a local guy who owned some land way out in the country and let our troop use it for camping. The actual campsite was in a wooded area in the center of a big open field that was maybe 20 acres. The guy who owned the land wasn't a full-time farmer, so he had plowed the field but never actually planted anything, and the dirt had kind of settled and scrubby grass had started to grow. I don't know. I'm not a farmer. Maybe there's some kind of term or something for that. Anyway, the western edge of the field was a dirt road that eventually led to the highway. The northern edge of the field was an old spot where planted trees were. It was practically a forest. The southern used to be a forest, but it was in the process of being turned into farmland and the trees had all been torn down but not removed, so it was just a wasteland of fallen tree trunks and roots. The eastern edge was a swamp, and there's some nasty stuff in swamps in South Carolina, so we never really explored it. One night after the post-dinner cleanup, everyone was kind of settling down for the night, so a few friends and I decided to go for a walk. There was one lone tree out in the field about halfway between the campsite and the western edge of the big field, so we walked out and sat under it. There was a full moon out, so the whole field was lit up in this sort of luminescent glow, and we could see the edges of the field, but not into the forest, swamp, or whatever was beyond. It was creepy, but kind of cool. We hung out for a while talking, and then we could see lights in our campsites across the field going out as people started going to sleep, so we decided it would be best to head back now. We got up and started walking when I heard one of my friends say, "Who's that?" We all turned to look, and there's this guy standing perfectly about 100 feet away from us. He was perfectly still, which made this so weird. We could see his silhouette pretty well thanks to the full moon, but it was too dark to make out any features on his face. I hadn't seen anyone come from the campsite, but the guy looked like an adult, so we assumed one of the 4 adults who had come on the trip was out looking for us. My friend called out to him, and then it got kind of weird. Something that looked kind of like wings slowly unfolded from the guy's head, and he still, remaining entirely still, let out this long, low growling hooting sound. Like imagine if a dog was trying to imitate an owl. We all took off running toward the campsite as fast as we could, and didn't stop until we got there. I looked back out into the field to see if we were being followed, but the field was empty. We walked around the campsite trying to figure out which adult was messing with us, but they were all in their tents, and nobody but us had left the campsite. Nobody believed us, of course. They just assumed we had all been out telling scary stories and freaked ourselves out. But I know what I saw. Actually, no, I don't know what we saw. But I know it was nothing we had ever brought out there with us. When I was 12 or 13, my Boy Scout troop was going on a camping trip to Gettysburg. We were camping outside of town, but not very far in, which is why I'm very confused to this day by what I saw. We were camping at the edge of the trees, in a field, and we were about to eat when I was asked to find the others down by the river. I went over and began calling out for the other scouts a few times, expecting them to come into view shortly. However, what I saw come into view instead was a black silhouette that looked like it was wearing a cap, a backpack, and a rifle. It walked left to right, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I followed the figure until it passed into the tree line and vanished. I wanted to be sure I wasn't seeing things and decided to rush toward the trail to see if maybe I could see if it was one of the kids, but there was nobody there. I continued to call out for the kids, and when I went down there, no one was around. I went around calling everyone until they turned up. I ultimately found them maybe around 100 yards to the right of where I saw the silhouette. I asked if they had been running around, but they all looked at me like I was crazy. They were sitting at the edge of the river throwing rocks in it the whole time. Later on, we learned that the area we were camping in, a battle took place during the Civil War. I've since told others about the story, but they insist I was just a kid with an overactive imagination. I know what I saw, and I'll never forget it, and I hardly think it was just me seeing things. I've read tons and tons of stories from this area about people seeing similar things, and I think with a great battle that happened there, there's no way energy is not being stored there. I would love to hear you guys' thoughts on what could be happening in Gettysburg. So growing up, I went to a pretty big 900-acre and well-known Boy Scout camp in Ohio. The staff would always tell stories of ghosts and omens in the camp. The camp had a heavy Native American influence. I always thought these were just stories. But one summer, when I was working there and experienced a lot of things for myself, kind of changed everything. A few more notes about the camp are, this camp does not have much electricity, with a few exceptions, and the campsites were just canvas tents and open pavilions and a latrine. Troops stay there for a full week, and then new troops come for the next week. The first story is about a man named Hutch. Hutch was one of the founders of the camp and I believe was a camp director long ago. It was always told that after taps were paid, curfew for the camp, and a scout was out of their campsite, he would walk with them. He would try to direct you in the correct way to get back to your campsite. If you heard footsteps to your left, he would want you to turn left. If you heard them in front of you, he would want you to keep going. If you heard them behind you, he wanted you to turn around and so on. If you heard him walking, it was said that you could say, "It's okay, Hutch, I know my way," and he would leave. Flash forward to when I worked there. The paths in the woods to go back to the staff site were flooded, so myself and 2 other staff walked the main road to get to them. Scouts were not allowed to go near this road, because safety and stuff like that, and also they just had no reason to. As soon as we reached the road, we started hearing footsteps. At first, they were to our left, which was where our path was. Once we started walking on the road, they were behind us. Not sure if we were just hearing things, we stopped. There were a couple more steps behind us, then they stopped. We continued and tried this a few more times with almost the exact same results every time. Finally, one of the guys I was with stops and says, "It's okay, Hutch, we know our way." And oddly, the steps started to walk away. We continued on and didn't hear them for the rest of the time. The second story involves our radios. Only higher up staff got them, and only one of the 3 female staff members had one. One night, a female voice comes through the radio and is crying and screaming for help. A silent emergency, an emergency only certain staff members know about, was issued and a head count was performed. The crying and pleas for help kept coming through the radio every few minutes. One staff member goes to the tent the female staff member is in and discovers her asleep with her radio sitting on the charger. The emergency was cancelled, and to this day, no one can seem to explain it. The final story I will share involves the omens. One omen is of a white wolf with red eyes that when seen means something bad will happen over the course of the summer. The other is a white doe with blue eyes that brings a good summer. During our opening staff week, we were setting up camp and it had gotten late at night. Only a few staff were still out working. One of the last ones comes back, a program director, and joins a few of us sitting by the fire. Everyone says hi but immediately notices this worried look. When we asked him what was wrong, he doesn't want to talk, but finally tells us because we were all directors and assistant directors. He tells us that while coming back he felt an overwhelming cold sensation, and when he turned around, he saw the white wolf standing on the path behind him. We all wondered about what it was warning us about. Everything was good until Scout Week 2 of 7. A few scouts got very sick, but it happens, so no one batted an eye about it. The next week, significantly more scouts get sick, and it just keeps getting worse every week. The staff gets sick and the whole campsite was quarantined. We called in health departments from several counties to help us solve the problem, but no one could figure out why this was happening. They even did soil and water tests all around the camp. I fully believe the white wolf was warning us about it. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed these creepy Boy Scout stories, be sure to hit that like button as it helps me out a ton. If you're new to the channel, why not subscribe and join the swamp? Turn on notifications to never miss a new video, as I upload them almost every single day on all things natural and supernatural. I'm always looking for stories to share, so if you have a story, be sure to send it in to swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. Wow, these Boy Scout experiences were definitely creepy, and it makes me kind of happy that I never ended up being one. I would love to share more, so if you guys have more, be sure to send it in to swampdweller.net. If you guys ever want to talk to me outside of YouTube, whether it be for personal reasons or you just want to say hi, join me on Instagram at swampdwellerofficial, or join me on Twitter at iSwampDweller. I would love to talk with you guys. I'll see you guys soon with another creepy video.